Type October 27th, 1962 into your search engine, and you'll recognize the set of events. That day, the 12th of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted 13, a Soviet missile shot an American spy plane out of the Cuban sky, bringing the standoff to its most treacherous point.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
What you won't find is any word about an incident aboard a Soviet sub that almost ended the world. Today, Donald Trump has the nuclear codes at his fingertips. The decision to launch a weapon is his alone. And the president's favorite approach to diplomacy is to trade insults with the leader of North Korea on Twitter. A cool head does not seem to be one of his superpowers. But buried deep in the National Security Archives is a story about a very different man. Let's go back inside that Soviet sub, deep in the waters off the coast of Cuba. It was one of 4 deployed to enemy lines and armed with a nuclear weapon, just in case. But on board, the conditions were bad. None of the subs were designed for operations in tropical waters, and it was miserably hot. Over 120 degrees in some parts of the ship. The men were sick. They were fainting. They had swollen feet and rashes that wouldn't go away. They were starting to go a little nuts. But they couldn't let their guard down for even 1 second. In his diary, Soviet submariner Anatoly Petrovich Andreev wrote, "We are in the enemy's lair, and we can't reveal our presence to them. But they sense our nearness and are searching for us. They detected us yesterday, but we managed to escape. Something exploded somewhere, but at a distance from us, so we don't know how serious it was." The enemy, the United States, was too close for comfort.
We were one of 8 destroyers with what we called Huck Group Alpha. Huck is an unfortunate term which sounds very warlike because it stands for Hunter-Killer Group. And I assure you I've never killed anybody or attempted to, and nor were we trying to on this particular day. We were hunting.
Captain John Peterson was a lieutenant on the USS Beale. When they spotted the Soviet sub, Peterson and his crew followed orders. They sent warning signals in the form of grenades to let the submarine know to surface.
We did indeed, from that point, drop some signaling hand grenades, I would call them, signaling charges.
But confused by the heat, their own sense of danger, and let's be honest, in retrospect, grenades probably weren't the best idea. The men on board the Soviet submarine interpreted the explosions as an incoming attack. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, started shouting. Maybe the war had already begun. They had to launch their weapons lest they die in disgrace. If the Soviets were going down, they were going to take everyone else with them. According to submariner Vadim Orlov, Savitsky ordered the crew to assemble the nuclear torpedo. If not for the cool head of a quiet commander named Vasily Arkhipov, the submarine's nuclear attack would almost certainly have escalated into a full-scale nuclear war. As it turns out, Savitsky needed the consent of all 3 senior officers on board to launch the weapon, more than our own U.S. nuclear chain of command. We can never know exactly what was said. We have no record of that. But according to accounts, 1 minute the captain was flipping out, and then he wasn't. According to Archipov's wife, Olga, there was an argument. Somehow, Arkhipov convinced the captain to surface the ship. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved in a secret back-channel agreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Where deterrence almost failed, cool heads and diplomacy saved the day, both above the water and below. And that's the thing about war. Sometimes it's easier to stumble into it than not. And sometimes the tools that keep us out of war, things like diplomacy, are invisible to the rest of America. Welcome to Things That Go Boom from PRI and Inkstick Media, a podcast about the ins, outs, and what have yous of what keeps us safe. I'm Lacey Healy, and over the course of the next 4 weeks, we'll explore a whole lot of things, like what national security has to do with home security, white supremacy, and our sense of connection in a society that can sometimes feel like a war. But we'll also talk about hidden poetry and Nancy Sinatra. and we'll ask if design might have the power to change the world. I've been working in nuclear and defense policy for over a decade, and I'll be honest, a lot of this stuff is still just as much a mystery to me as it is to you. And my teenage experience as a rodeo queen isn't helping at all. So today, we'll start with something that feels maybe a little too familiar. The president's big red button, and the less obvious forces behind it, in 3 parts. First, what deterrence has to do with being an 11-year-old boy. Then, the Trump administration's assault on diplomacy. And, finally, a story about a bear. All right, hey, Austin.
Hi.
How you doing?
Doing good.
Who are you? Why do we know each other?
I'm Austin Healy, and I'm Lacey's stepson.
My husband and I met in 2007. Austin wasn't quite 2. He was all eyes and sweet, syrupy hands, and I fell in love right away with them both. Austin's 11 now. His dad and I got married when he was 6, so we passed that whole discipline hurdle a long time ago. Which isn't to say that it's easy. I definitely struggle with my credible threat. Which is why I thought I'd ask Austin about nuclear deterrence, and stay with me here. You see, the whole idea of deterrence is that if the US has a nuclear weapon and North Korea has a nuclear weapon, the 2 countries won't use them on each other because then the other country would just use theirs right back. It's an old Cold War theory called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And it's a lot like what we do with our kids. So I wanted to talk to you because last night there was this sort of perfect moment to illustrate something that we're talking about on the podcast. And that was that you were, I can't even remember, I actually think you were joking around a little bit, but you threatened to throw a plate across the room, right?
Yeah, I definitely was joking there.
But then what did I say? Do you remember what I said?
I honestly can.
So I think I said something like, if you want to see what happens to you when you throw that plate across the room, you can go ahead and do it, right?
Oh, now that you mentioned it, yeah, I do remember that.
Does that sound like something I would say?
Yes. It definitely does.
And so when I say something like that to you, what do you think?
Holy cow, she's not joking.
Yeah, you do?
Like, there's this tone in your voice like, I am not joking.
You take me seriously then?
Yes,
Okay.
I take you seriously.
All right. So if I say something like, you're going to lose your iPad.
I take that seriously because I know you're going to do it because you've done it before.
Well, I guess that's a pretty good point, isn't it? So what if I made threats and then I didn't follow through on them? Would you take them as seriously?
No, not really.
No.
But I still wouldn't throw a plate across the room. That's just not okay.
Because you're just a good kid.
Yeah.
He really is a pretty good kid. He rarely tests the limits, but sometimes he does. Deterrence isn't perfect. And if I made a threat and said, you're going to be in big trouble, but then you weren't actually in big trouble after you did it, would you do it again?
Probably do it again. And again. And again.
Because, there aren't as big of consequences,
Yeah.
Right? So why is that, do you think?
Because I realize that you're not going to punish me on this, so why not do it?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Why not do it again and again? I mean, if there's no consequence and I can get away with it, then why not?
I'm not saying North Korea is a bad kid. I mean, I think they probably want to keep their iPad just as much as the rest of us. But if they were inclined to test the limits, especially if it looked like they might be able to get away with it, they might just go ahead. Walk right up to the edge. Maybe even conduct a test in the Pacific. And this is where the balance of nuclear weapons gets very dangerous, where the idea of deterrence as a safety net against their use starts to really break down. Because in order to present a credible threat, President Trump has drawn a red line. He said that a North Korean missile capable of reaching the U.S., quote, won't happen. Never mind that by some estimates that ship has already sailed. If North Korea decides to test Trump's red line, if it walks right up to it and gingerly places one toe over the edge, what do? Parents, we've been there. Our toddler wants to play in the puddle, We say no. They move to the mud. Again, we say no. They run along the edge of the mud, getting just as dirty and just as wet, but technically they're doing what we said, right? And at this point, it's just too complicated to do more. We've been had. This is the risk Trump is taking with threats. Based on its history, we know North Korea will continue to test the limits. And eventually, it's very likely that we'll be faced with a point where Trump's red line has clearly been challenged. At that point, Trump has two choices. Launch an attack on North Korea, potentially leading to the harm of many citizens in Seoul and even possibly those in the United States, or don't. Render the U.S. a helpless, tired parent of a muddy toddler. I don't want to go too far with the analogy. North Korea isn't our kid, and we're not North Korea's parent. But much like the relationship between parent and child, threats and consequences aren't really the best way to get things done. They're a last resort. And we should always hope, as parents and as citizens of any country, to be able to achieve our aims without resorting to war. At the end of the day, all any of us really wants is a glass of wine and some peace. So here's the other option. The other option is to step far away from the mud, take a deep breath, and talk it out.
I'm Alex Bell. I'm the Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation.
She used to be at the State Department.
As I was there for 7 years, most recently as the Director for Strategic Outreach in the Office of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security.
Awesome. And so some of the major issues that you worked on while you were there.
First was the ratification of the New START Treaty.
And that was a nuclear reductions treaty with Russia.
Absolutely. It was the first nuclear reductions treaty ever negotiated by a woman. And then moved on to all sorts of things, U.S.-Russia, nuclear policy issues, multilateral nuclear affairs, all the fun stuff.
You might never have heard of the New START Treaty. That's New START like new beginning. Or if you have, maybe you didn't pay that much attention.
The technical details of the treaty tend to make people sort of go to sleep. So it was my job to sort of like, how do you take all this information and get it into an accessible form? Like, can I describe this to my mom and will she get it? Or I used to think about, guys on my football team, my rural North Carolina high school, like, would they get this if I was telling them about it?
And so how did you describe the New START Treaty to guys on your football team?
Like, if there were beers involved, probably just like, you want the Russians to have less nuclear weapons and we want to be able to look at their stuff.
The treaty reduces the number of weapons on both sides. So fewer U.S. weapons, fewer Russian weapons. And it allows for stronger verification of compliance with the treaty. A wonky way of saying it allows us to look at their stuff. But that treaty took years to negotiate. Most do. It might have been easier and faster to start throwing mud.
Diplomacy takes a while. It's slow and it's tedious and it doesn't make for good stories. And, you don't...
You don't drop a bomb.
Yeah, well, you think about the Moab, the mother of all bombs, and then the strike in Syria that Trump did. The media was absolutely fawning over these things and their images, and they're talking about how impressive it is. Nobody gets on TV and says, guess what? The work of the International Security and Nonproliferation Bureau at the State Department made it so no terrorists got a nuclear bomb today. Hooray. Like, nonproliferation working means nothing is happening.
But President Trump's first budget proposal slashed the State Department's funding by 30%. And the building is starting to look like a ghost town.
Basically, every relevant position on nuclear and WMD policy is open right now at state, and a lot still at DOD. So.
And then most policy.
Yeah.
Most of the positions are
regional actor. We don't have an ambassador. We have an ambassador in the Bahamas, but not in Seoul.
The rationale behind Trump's proposed cut to state seems to be that the president and his OMB director, Mick Mulvaney, were looking for savings. Here's Mackenzie Eaglin, a budget expert with the American Enterprise Institute.
I would put it this way. If you're a green eye shade person and you're just looking at the numbers dispassionately, as I believe Mick Mulvaney often does, across the U.S. federal government, what you see is the biggest target, the juiciest, most attractive one, of course, is the Defense Department. It's not only the largest federal agency, it's larger than every other one combined. Okay, but however, we have a candidate who campaigned on this and a president who wants to follow through, so you have to put for this year anyway, check your ideological impulses at the door. And then when you go down the target list of the big, giant, juicy budgets, the intelligence community is basically the second biggest. The Veterans Affairs Department might rival it. They're about probably equal. But then just following that is DHS and the State Department. And that's why.
And that's why. So it's just where you can get the most money.
Yeah, exactly. That's why Willie Sutton said, you robbed the bank because that's where the money's at.
Whatever the political purpose, it seems that while the State Department is becoming more anemic, the Defense Department is getting fatter. Trump's budget took a meat axe to almost everything. Domestic programs focused on science and research, the arts, and most social welfare programs included. But it increased the Pentagon's budget by more than $50 billion. And while Congress rejected most of Trump's proposed cuts, it more than agreed with that bump. In fact, Senators McCain and Thornberry thought the Pentagon should have about $40 billion more. And there are a lot of possible reasons for this strong congressional support.
This is not just a Trump administration thing. The State Department often has its budget cut while the Defense Department has its budget plussed up. And that is sort of a symptom of a larger problem, which is that diplomacy is often sort of seen as the sissy option, I think. And going even a little deeper, diplomacy is often seen as sort of the female option. I guess my opinion is clear, but do you think that there is an innate bias sort of in our treatment of diplomacy, and that that's something that maybe is intricately tied to a bias around women in national security?
There's a number of reasons this is hard. It's DoD has a constituency. The military-industrial complex is stretched across this country. Lots of people work for contractors or bases, or they have family members in the military. The Department of Defense has been, quite smart in how it sort of spread out its assets. So, members of Congress feel obligated to make sure programs are being sustained because it has an effect on the people in their community. I think one of the only things State Department has outside of the D.C. area is our payroll comes out of Charleston, South Carolina. But I've yet to see the South Carolina delegation, go to the mattresses. When it comes to, is diplomacy female? Yeah, I think there's an inherent bias that sitting down and talking about your problems is something your mom made you do. And we're still sort of fighting against this idea that we can, sort of bully our way out of problems, because that's what America does, and America's strong. But actually the thing that has made America strong is, our reliance on not soft power, but smart power.
That was Alex Bell again. And in recent years, in the wake of 9/11, we've also transferred a lot of states' responsibilities to DoD. Suddenly, the military, an institution built on force, is vaccinating cattle and training judges in Afghanistan, taking on the traditional roles of state and other agencies, and doing it without the same expertise. If the Trump administration doubles down on this trend, continuing to move jobs to the military and cutting everything else, the military option is all we could have left. And that's a dangerous possibility.
Jim Mattis, when he was a general before he became Secretary of Defense, testified in front of Congress and said, if you don't give State Department the money they need, you're going to have to buy me more bullets. I can't think of a more plain way to say that if we don't have a strong diplomatic front, we are going to get into more wars.
Here's one last story, another one from 1962. We know by now that things were bad. It looked like war between the US and Soviet Union might break out any minute, and the Air Force was on the highest alert in its history. According to protocol, planes had been dispersed to small airfields around the country. The planes carried nuclear weapons and, if necessary, pilots were prepared to use them. It was in the middle of this tense environment that a guard at the Duluth Sector Direction Center in Minnesota spotted a shadowy figure climbing the fence. Spooked, the guard shot at what he thought was an intruder, activating a sabotage alarm that sounded across all of the bases in the area. But at Volk Field in Wisconsin, the wrong alarm rang. Instead of signaling an intruder at another base, an alarm ordered the takeoff of nuclear-armed fighter jets. Because they were already on high alert, pilots knew this wasn't a drill. They scrambled to their fighters, hoping to move quickly enough to intercept Soviet bombers coming over the North Pole. A 27-year-old lieutenant named Dan Barry recounted the incident later to the La Crosse Tribune. He said, much like the captain on board that fateful Soviet sub, that he thought nuclear war had already begun. I can remember almost expecting to see inbound nuclear missiles, he said. Luckily, the pilots established communication with the Duluth Center before taking off, and they were quickly corrected. Much later, as the result of a request initiated under the Freedom of Information Act, Stanford University professor Scott Sagan uncovered the mystery of the shadowy figure that kicked the whole mess off. And, as it turns out, it was an intruder, just not the kind you think. It was a bear. A hungry, curious bear who we can only assume was looking for a picnic basket and instead received a very rude awakening. But we can learn something from that bear. We have a lot of very dangerous weapons at our disposal. And we, well, most of us at least, we're all just human. Things happen. Deterrence isn't foolproof. Gut check reactions can lead very, very quickly to war. And the long, hard work of diplomacy is, at its very best, invisible. A trait that threatens to render gut check reactions the norm. This is to say nothing of our current president, whose penchant for the military option seems even to outweigh that of the military men he relies on as his closest advisors. In Trump's America, diplomacy is probably more important than ever. But in Trump's America, diplomacy could be lost. Things That Go Boom is a podcast about the ins, outs, and what have yous of what keeps us safe from PRI and Inkstick Media. This episode was produced by Tracy Wall and written by me. Our music was composed by Darian Schulman, and Abdullah Rufus was our technical advisor. Thank you to N Square and Plowshares Fund for supporting this work. On next week's show, what we mean when we say national security and who we protect.